So yeah,
Yeah.
prequel. I don't know, can you guys see this?
Yeah.
Nice. Yeah. So it's pretty cool. Basically it's a novel load balancing system. It's there is prior art that uses like a similar strategy, but prequel is novel in that it uses this mixture of probing for both latency and number of open requests. So it basically requires that the server have instrumented and implemented a a library that will track the number of open active RPCs on that node, and then also the latency being experienced um, on that server. So there's these, yeah, two factors. It doesn't the load balancer is interesting in that it does not care about CPU utilization or direct that you look at memory or any of these other standard factors. Instead, it just uses um, the number of open requests and the amount of latency experienced recently. So it's like there's two factors. One is prior latency, and the second is um, current open requests. So it's like one's historic latency, the other is what's happening right now, which is the number of open requests. Um, Yeah, so this is like the rough idea of the layout. It can be used in a bunch of different ways, which makes it kind of interesting. So like it's the standard request response flow that I'm sure we're all pretty used to. So you can deploy it as a centralized load balancer, or you can use it for client-side load balancing. It's pretty fairly agnostic. Um, Yeah, and you can see here, like, we have this concept that the authors used of like antagonistic load generation. So they're really interested in what happens when you expose this load balancer to the general public, right? And if you receive load that is um, potentially a worst case scenario for the underlying system, how will it behave and how will it direct traffic so that you don't fall over? So the strategy that sits at the guts of it is these two signals I've already mentioned, requests and flight. So that's basically open RPCs and latency. So one is the present, request and flight. The other is the past, which is scene latency, effectively. So it tries to find the minimum of these two. It has an interesting solution in that it has a concept of hot and cold nodes. So like a node is considered hot if there is a large number of requests in flight, and it's considered cold if it has a low number of requests in flight. So if there are any cold nodes, it just chooses the lowest latency of the cold nodes. And when it's hot, there is a separate strategy where it will pick again based on latency.
Peter,
Yep.
these two signals are not the same quantity. One is request in flight, the other is latency. How do they compare and find the minimum? Do they
Yeah.
normalize?
So I think it finds the minimum kind of separately almost. So it's almost like hierarchical in that like you have like hot, which is the nodes that have a large number of requests in flight,
Hmm.
and then you have latency, which is like a separate factor it uses to choose between cold nodes. So
Hmm. Oh,
you want to look for a cold node ideally with a low latency, and it will pick that node.
okay. Hmm.
Yeah, so like the guts of what makes this interesting from other solutions is that it uses asynchronous probing. So it has a probe request that it sends to gather the statistics of the node that it's contacting. So uh, basically, the tool will send out a request, get back a response that then hands it the statistics. All the other existing load balancer implementations basically try to derive these statistics based on what the load balancer knows. Whereas this solution is interesting in that it's periodically probing the systems asynchronously. So it's out of the hot path of the decision, but it's still maintaining the statistics about the nodes that it's load balancing over. It's interesting because the authors actually built it as a policy inside of gRPC. So it's not actually a particularly complicated system to necessarily add to your existing stack. Yeah. Yeah, so the what they saw is a massive reduction in tail latency, which is of sort of like the primary concern that they were dealing with at YouTube, which is like how do they cut that tail latency for delivering a homepage to an end user, was the main thing they were looking at. So they cut their tail latency in half, and they did as much as cut their tail of like number of open requests, the RAF, by 5 to 10, which is pretty incredible. And interestingly, in so doing, in spite of the fact they didn't explicitly care about CPU utilization or memory usage, they did also see significant drops in tail for memory usage and tail for CPU utilization. And cutting and they saw almost complete elimination of errors due to improper load balancing. So like seeing, and they actually, and it was kind of neat, interesting that they said that this was likely because of the way weighted round robin, which was their previous strategy, would allow for requests to arrive at dead nodes due to the windowing system it used. So they had much more up-to-date information about active nodes with their periodic probes. So they were able to decide that there were too many requests in flight, or the latency had gotten too high on an erroring node, and they were able to route traffic more efficiently and minimize the damage where the CPU was spiking on a weighted round, whereas a weighted round robin would still see this historic utilization of CPU, and it wouldn't account for the fact that actually there were 40 requests in flight already directed to a node. So it's sort of like for a 1 minute interval, all the load balancer knows is that there was low CPU utilization on a node. So it will direct like 40 RPCs to that node, and then suddenly that CPU will spike really high and you'll see high errors. Um, yeah, so this is the heat map of um, utilization on nodes, and the line and this drop off is when they switch to Prequal, which is pretty incredible. Okay.
Mm.
Again, yeah,
What in this previous graph, what does yellow mean? What does red mean? And what does a
sure.
wide range of yellow mean versus
Yeah,
red?
so yellow it's showing a distribution. So if we're looking at like let's say 1,000 servers all serving YouTube's traffic, the yellow ranges are like the spread basically of their servers. So like some servers had very high utilization. The majority, like the actual like mean utilization, kind of remained the same, right? But you notice that the spread of utilization has cut. So it's the tail that's been cut. Um, so we no longer have utilization at like I can't read the chart on the side, sorry. But we no longer have like these spikes out into like overutilization. We instead have a much like
Yeah,
tighter cohesion to the mean. So it's like it's fewer standard deviations away from the mean, I guess.
yeah,
Does that make sense?
makes sense.
Yeah.
Makes sense. And the red is like heavily utilized, I guess. So dark red, is that
That's
necessarily bad or not?
no, it's not. It's just showing that's where most nodes are. So it means they're not
Oh, I see.
being properly utilized. So like
Okay,
an
got it.
ideal graph would be like a single black line, I guess.
Got it. Got it. Got it. Got it. Okay, awesome. Thank you.
No worries. Thank you. That's a great question. Cool. So if you look at like P99, top graph is showing error rate. We notice that 8 a.m., we see that error rate just plummet to basically non-existent. Periodically, we would see these bursts of error, and it seems it's potentially, and like it's at least it's a strong correlation to say that that error rate was just due to improper load balancing. So this new policy seems to have just effectively, as the author stated, removed load balancing based errors from YouTube's traffic. And here we're looking at latency on the bottom. So you see our P99 latency has plummeted. Even our P99 and P99.9 both collapse here, thanks to better load balancing. P50 remains fairly standard and similar. Cool. So yeah, so the system design is fairly simple. It relies on some invariants that the authors kind of tucked into the paper, which is that each client has only a small subset of the upstream replicas. So like for a given node, I'm only ever looking at 4 out of 400 upstream replicas, and each replica is only being looked at by maybe like 20 downstream clients. So they basically kind of rely on this and random sampling to prevent one from preventing all the clients from picking the same replica. So they use this mixture of a random uniform distribution to pick amongst replicas that are similar, and also a uniform random distribution of which clients are going to be able to pick which replicas. Um, I won't dig too deep into like reuse and removal, but there's a basic idea of each time we probe, there is an algorithm, a function that says that the statistics we've collected from performing a probe have become stale, or that that node is depleted, or there's some form of degradation in that probe, and we will basically drop the probe, and a probe here means the statistics that we've collected from a replica, from an upstream. So we will have collected the latency and also the requests in flight. Uh, the replica selection, yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, yeah. So this is the algorithm. If all probes in the pool are hot, so basically if all the replicas are hot, they all have a large number of requests in flight. Then we'll choose the one with the lowest request in flight. And I lied to you earlier, Murat, I'm sorry. And then for a cold probe, so if there is a probe where there is few requests in flight based on a threshold that's configurable, um, then we will select the one with the lowest latency. And this covers like an interesting use case that isn't as common, which is basically that uh, if your system has like a large memory consumption per request, which YouTube does, obviously like serving video, um, you will want to load balance to some extent based on requests in flight because you don't want to out of memory error on your node. Because each request is translating into a potentially a large chunk of memory, you'll want to configure the the threshold at which you denote a replica as hot um, to account for that. So like if I can handle five, if I can handle let's say I can handle 10 open requests, because they each consume 10 megabytes of my 100 megabytes, let's say, I might consider a node hot if there are six requests in flight against that node. And at that point, I'll start looking at cold nodes with the lowest latency. This is how we select replicas. And this is the novel part of the algorithm versus existing load balances. This plus the probe. So they size 16 probe responses in a pool, and those are the nodes that the replicas that will get considered. And then the rate at which you send the probe is configurable, and um, they recommended like a fairly high frequency because the latency and the cost of doing it was low in general, was what they saw in their implementation. And yeah, and then load signals, that is the request in flight. And they wanted to note that it's the time spent processing the RPC itself before it gets handed back to the RPC framework, so gRPC. So it would be, it's tracking that latency and that for requests in flight. Cool. Um, oh, where are we going to? Oh, yeah, that might be it. Yeah. Um, yeah, so I didn't dig too deep into the results. Uh, the guts of it were basically that they outperformed any existing solution. There is a solution called C3 that's pretty close and uses a similar algorithm, but they beat it by like a fairly small margin, but they outperformed weighted round robin by a significant amount. And yeah, that's the paper. Any questions?